Hello, everyone. I wish you a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore what happens when Diep is cornered not by an enemy, but by her own fear, and how one quiet morning with Jame and Mrs Huyen might finally change everything. Diep woke before the sun, not because she wanted to, because her body didn't know how to stay asleep. In the dark, she listened the way other people listened for comfort. A car passing outside, a distant dog bark, the refrigerator clicking. Her heart treated every sound like a question. Safe or not? She slipped out of bed without waking Nee. The little girl was curled up small, one hand still holding the hem of Diep's shirt. Diep padded into the kitchen and turned on the smallest light. She poured warm water into a mug and held it with both hands, as if heat could teach her to trust. Her phone buzzed on the table. Diep froze. She didn't pick it up right away. She watched the screen glow like it might bring bad news. When she finally looked, it wasn't an unknown number, it was a simple clinic reminder. Follow-up appointment available. A normal message. Still, her fingers shook around the mug. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Diep turned too fast. Nye stood in the doorway, hair messy, eyes half open. She whispered, "Mom?" "I'm here," Diep said. Nye leaned against Diep's hip. "You didn't sleep?" Diep forced a small smile. "I slept. A little." Nye stared at the mug. "Warm water." Diep nodded. "Warm water." Nye yawned. "Can Uncle Jame come today?" Diep's throat tightened. "Maybe," she said, because yes still felt like tempting fate. Nye nodded like maybe was enough and shuffled back to the bedroom. "Tell him I saved a chair," she mumbled, disappearing under the blanket. Diep stood with the mug in the quiet, trying to make her breath match the calm outside. A key turned in the lock. Her breath stopped. Her hand went to the counter, searching for something that wasn't there. She hated that reflex, reach, brace, guard. Then she heard the careful pause, the way someone entered, like the home mattered. "Diep?" James' voice low and gentle. Diep walked to the doorway and saw him holding a paper bag and a thin folded blanket. No expensive gift, no show, just simple things. "I didn't wake you, did I?" he asked. "I was already up," Diep said. James' eyes flicked to the tight grip on her mug. He didn't ask what happened in the night. He didn't demand an explanation. He lifted the bag a little. "Bread. Eggs. I found the kind Nye likes." Then the blanket. "It's thin, not heavy. Mornings are cold." "You didn't have to," Diep said. "I know," Jame replied. "I just want you to eat." The words were small, but they landed heavy in her chest. Jame washed his hands and started the stove. The pan warmed. Eggs cracked. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary smells. Diep realized how rare ordinary had become. Jame set 2 plates on the table and paused. The room felt too quiet, as if even the walls were waiting to see whether Diep would accept the morning or fight it. Diep surprised herself by speaking first. Before we eat, can we just do something simple?" James' eyebrows lifted. Of course. Diep didn't have fancy words. She just folded her hands around the mug, closed her eyes, and let one honest sentence fall out. "Please let this home be calm today." Mrs Huyen bowed her head with her. "Amen," she whispered. The word was small, but it landed like a soft blanket over the table. Diep opened her eyes and realized she wasn't alone in wanting peace. She wasn't the only one asking for it. For once, Diep felt her shoulders drop. While the eggs cooked, Jame asked, "How are you this morning?" Diep tried to answer fast. "Fine, okay, don't worry." But her mouth didn't move. Jame waited, wooden spoon in hand, like her truth wasn't inconvenient. Diep lowered her eyes. I wake up early, she admitted. I keep listening. For what? Jame asked, even though he knew. For anything, Diep said. Like if I relax, something will happen. Jame turned the heat down. Nothing has to happen today. Diep let out a short, bitter breath. My mind says that. My body doesn't. Jame slid a plate toward her, not pushing, just offering. Then we teach it. One morning at a time. A soft knock hit the door. Diep jumped. Jame moved calmly but quickly. He checked, then opened the door. Mrs Huyen stood there with a pot cradled in both arms, scarf snug, hair pinned neatly. She didn't step in like she owned the place. She waited, eyes gentle, reading the room. Good morning, she said. Then, without asking about the past, she asked only, Did you sleep? Diep blinked, caught by how simple it was. A little. Mrs Huyen nodded as if a little mattered. I brought soup, not to be praised, just for a warm stomach. Jame took the pot. Mom, you didn't have to come so early. Mrs Huyen's gaze stayed soft but firm. That's why I did. She moved to the counter and set the pot down on a folded towel. Small care, quiet respect. Nai's door opened again. The child wandered out, blinking, and brightened when she saw Jame. Uncle Jame! Jame crouched. Good morning, sunshine. Nai looked at the kitchen chair near the corner. Then she dragged a second chair beside it, scraping the floor with stubborn determination. She patted the seat. Uncle Jame, sit here. This spot, I saved it. Diep covered her mouth. Tears rose fast, surprising, and quiet, like air finally leaving lungs that had been held too long. Jame looked up at her, understanding in his eyes. Then he sat where Ni told him to sit, like the place was sacred. Mrs Huyen ladled soup into bowls. She didn't stare at Diep's tears. She didn't say, Don't cry. She just slid a bowl forward and said, Eat while it's warm. They ate slowly. Spoon, breath, another spoon. Nai colored on the couch. Jame asked simple questions. Mrs Huyen listened more than she spoke. Diep noticed something that startled her. She was sitting with her back to the room, not facing the door. After breakfast, Jame rinsed the pan. Mrs Huyen rinsed bowls. Diep tried to help, but her hands hovered like they didn't know what to do with peace. Mrs Huyen turned off the faucet, wiped her hands, and looked at Diep. Come, she said, an invitation, not a command. Diep followed her to the window where the morning light had finally arrived. Mrs Huyen spoke softly. When I was young, I thought strength meant never shaking. Diep's fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve. Mrs Huyen continued. Then I watched my son become a man who carries too much without asking for help. And I saw you doing the same. Diep swallowed hard. I don't know everything you've been through, Mrs Huyen said, and I won't force you to tell me. But I can see what your body does, the way you turn too fast, the way you hold your breath. Jame's footsteps paused in the kitchen. He stayed close without stepping into the moment. Mrs Huyen placed her hand gently on Diep's shoulder, not gripping, not claiming. Just steady. Mrs Huyen kept her hand on Diep's shoulder and spoke like she was telling a truth she had carried for years. People think Jame is cold because he's a CEO, she said. But he was careful long before he had money. When he was little, if a grown man raised his voice, Jame would go quiet. He would put his toys in a straight line, like order could stop chaos. Diep's eyes flicked up. Mrs Huyen exhaled. Mr Huyan was not always gentle. He loved his family, but his pride was sharp. Jame learned to read rooms, to stay strong by staying silent. Diep felt something in her chest soften, not toward Mr Huyan, but toward the boy Jame used to be. That's why he doesn't shout back, Mrs Huyen said. And that's why, when he chooses you, it isn't a whim. It's him choosing a different life. I'm used to living like I always have to defend, Diep said, the truth flat and raw, even when nobody is attacking. That's not your fault, Mrs Huyen said. That's a habit your heart learned to survive. Diep's voice cracked. It's exhausting. I know, Mrs Huyen replied. A phone buzz cut the room. Diep flinched. Jame lifted his phone, glanced once, and said immediately, "It's just an email. Work. Nothing urgent." Diep released a breath she didn't realize she was holding. A small, embarrassed laugh escaped, like grief stepping out for a moment. Mrs Huyen nodded toward Ni, humming over her crayons. "She feels it," she said. "Children feel rooms." Diep looked at the drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun. Her chest ached in a way that wasn't pain alone. Diep watched Ni color with her tongue peeking out in concentration. The child had once been a stranger on a roadside. Small, hands dirty, eyes too old for her age. Diep had taken her home with nothing but a promise. You will not be alone again. That promise had made Diep brave. It had also made her vigilant. If she failed, Nai would feel the world's coldness again. Now, seeing Nai save a chair for Uncle Jame, Diep felt a new kind of responsibility rise. One that didn't come from fear, but from hope. Could she let love share the weight she had carried by herself? Jame asked, quietly, "Do you want to rest?" Diep shook her head. If I lie down, I'll listen again." Mrs Huyen opened her bag and took out a plain notebook. She handed it to Diep. "Then don't lie down. Sit. Write one thing you can control today. One thing you can leave for tomorrow." Diep stared at the blank page. "I don't know what to write." Mrs Huyen smiled faintly. "Write, I ate breakfast. That counts." Jame draped the thin blanket over the chair back, within reach, without wrapping it around her. Nai looked up. "Uncle Jame, you stay?" Jamie glanced at Diep before answering. "I'm here. For today." Nai returned to coloring, satisfied by the present. Diep sat by the window with the notebook open. Her pen hovered. Mrs Huyen sat across from her, not talking, just breathing. Jame moved quietly in the kitchen, making the home sound alive in gentle ways. Diep wrote, "I ate breakfast." Then Nai laughed. Then slower. "I am safe in this moment." Her eyes blurred, not because she believed it fully, because she wanted to. Mrs Huyen leaned forward. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "will you come with me a little?" "Where?" Diep asked. "Just to the market," Mrs Huyen said. "Or a quiet garden, somewhere with people who don't know your story, somewhere your body can learn that the world can be normal." Diep hesitated. The old fear rose. "If I trust, I lose." James stopped, met her eyes, steady and patient. Diep glanced at Ni's saved chair and the drawing of 3 hands connected. Her fingers tightened around the pen. Slowly, she nodded once. "Yes," she whispered, like it was both a decision and a prayer. Mrs Huyen's hand returned to her shoulder for one gentle second. "Good," she said. Outside, the sun cleared the rooftops. The light came in warm and plain, as if it had always been there. Diep still felt fear in the corners of her mind, but for the first time, she could see a path around it. And inside that quiet kitchen, a new question formed, soft, persistent, hopeful. If tomorrow can be normal, what else can be healed after that?
Diệp tỉnh giấc rất bình minh vì thói quen cảnh giác, chỉ dám ôm cốc nước để trấn an mình. Một tiếng rung điện thoại cũng đủ làm cô đông cứng, dù đó chỉ là lời nhắc tái khám. Nhi thức dậy hỏi: chú Jame có đến không, và nói con đã để sẵn một cái ghế. Jame xuất hiện